Have you ever done nothing and become unforgettable? Not because you vanished with fury, not because you played harder to get, but because, for the first time, you stepped back, not in silence, but into sovereignty. There's a particular kind of woman he never forgets. The one who stopped trying to be understood. The one who didn't fill the silence with anxious explanations. The one who didn't perform, didn't plead, didn't soften herself just to be held. She didn't disappear. She returned to herself, and in doing so, something ancient shifted. His mind tries to make sense of the absence, but it can't, because it wasn't absence at all. It was a presence so full, so whole, it no longer needed to prove itself. He doesn't chase you because you left. He chases because the energy that once held him no longer holds him. This isn't manipulation. This is alchemy. If something stirs in you as you listen, like, comment, subscribe, this isn't just content. It's a conversation that begins with your voice. Because maybe you're not here to be louder. Maybe you're here to be missed. And when a woman stops chasing, she doesn't become invisible. She becomes unforgettable. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." What you think is rejection is often activation. What you think is distance is often depth arriving. And what you believe is about him is often an invitation back to you. You've been taught to love through visibility, to stay present, to stay patient, to keep showing up even when your presence is no longer seen. But here's the deeper truth. Presence becomes invisible when it is over-offered. When you're always there, always understanding, always holding the weight of the relationship, you stop being a mystery and become a mirror. A mirror he looks into only when it flatters him. But Jung's work, especially his insights on the anima, tells us something older than any dating advice ever could. Men don't fall in love with what is constantly available. They fall in love with what awakens them. And nothing awakens a man like the sudden realization that your energy is no longer orbiting his. The anima is the inner feminine, the unconscious image of woman that lives in every man's psyche. She is not loud. She does not shout. She does not beg to be seen. She haunts. She whispers. She pulls. She is not awakened by noise, but by essence, by mystery, by the echo of what once felt eternal and then one day was simply gone. You see, a man's unconscious does not respond to logic. It responds to symbols, to shifts in energy, to what disappears without explanation. When your energy withdraws, not in punishment, not in protest, but in quiet reclamation, he doesn't just notice, he feels it, and his unconscious begins to stir. He may not even understand why he starts thinking about you again, why your name suddenly lingers, why he replays your voice, your laughter, the softness in your presence. But I'll tell you why. Because the mirror cracked. You stopped reflecting his needs. You stopped feeding his comfort. And now he has to meet himself. This is the paradox Jung pointed to again and again. What you resist persists. But more powerfully still, what you take for granted begins to dissolve. Your withdrawal isn't emptiness. It's an energetic rupture. And within that rupture, his psyche begins its work. Not because you intended it, but because you removed the thing that kept his ego at ease. He didn't fall in love with you because you were always available. He fell asleep in your light, because you never dimmed it long enough for him to realize it wasn't the sun, it was you. And now, in your absence, the room feels colder. Jung taught that love is rarely about the other. It is about projection, about what the other awakens in us that we've forgotten, repressed, or denied. You were the symbol. You were the mirror. You were the sacred disturbance that offered him a glimpse of his own soul. But when that mirror stops reflecting, when you stop reaching, explaining, accommodating, the man who once coasted on your presence is forced to ask a question his ego has avoided. Who am I without her reflection? That question is where the chase begins, not for you, but for the part of himself he only met in your orbit. So understand this, your silence isn't the absence of love, it is the presence of truth. And when you stop overgiving, over-explaining, over-accommodating, you don't become distant. You become symbolic. You become a presence he cannot decode. A memory that doesn't fade. A symbol that haunts the very part of him Jung spent a lifetime trying to illuminate. The unconscious desire for wholeness. And that desire, it doesn't wake up when you perform. It wakes up when you return to your center and quietly stop spinning around his. There's a moment in every woman's journey when she grows tired, not just of him, but of herself in relation to him. Tired of the explaining, tired of the softening, tired of the quiet ache that builds every time you give just one more piece of yourself, hoping he'll finally see the whole. But he doesn't. Not because you aren't enough, but because you've given him too much to feel your weight. You've filled the space so completely, so graciously, that he's forgotten there was ever a space to begin with. And when a space is never empty, it is never missed. You've been taught to keep the connection alive by feeding it. But connection doesn't thrive on constant attention. It thrives on polarity, on breath, on the subtle tension between presence and mystery. You were never meant to be an endless flame, always burning. You were meant to be firelight, seen, felt, and protected, not consumed. And so here's the paradox. He doesn't remember the woman who stayed. He remembers the woman who left without closing the door too loudly. The woman who stepped back, not in anger, but in wholeness. The woman who stopped performing for love and started becoming it. Because something changes when you stop managing how he sees you. You stop being predictable, and unpredictability unsettles the ego. Suddenly, he's not in control of the emotional ecosystem anymore. He can't anticipate your response, can't reach for the same comfort, because the comfort has left the room. This is where he starts to chase, but not because you wanted him to, because something deeper, older, got activated. A man does not fall in love with your proximity, he falls in love with your gravity. And gravity isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself, it pulls, subtle, inescapable. Silent, ancient. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the ways in which we chase what we've exiled within ourselves. You became his mirror, his muse, not because of what you gave, but because of what you reflected back to him. Your stillness, your complexity, your intuition, all the things he may not know how to hold in himself. And when you withdraw that reflection, when you stop giving him an emotional home without asking for rent, he doesn't just lose you. He loses access to the version of himself that only existed in your presence. And that loss is unnameable. It doesn't come with fanfare or tears. It arrives as a subtle emptiness, a room that feels colder, a morning that arrives heavier, because now, for the first time, he feels the void. Not as punishment, but as revelation. She's not here. And I didn't even realize how much I depended on her being. You were the warmth, you were the silence that held meaning. You were the emotional frequency that steadied his chaos without demanding applause. And when that frequency fades, when your signal quiets, his unconscious takes over. The anima, dormant and unacknowledged, begins to stir. She whispers, "You lost something sacred," not because she disappeared, but because you never truly showed up while she was here. And suddenly he's haunted. Not by a text you didn't send, not by a door you slammed, but by the echo of your energy. You became a memory he couldn't mute, because you stopped explaining, you stopped reminding, you stopped offering your soul in fragments he never had to earn. And in that stillness, you became an archetype. You see, archetypes don't beg, they don't prove, they resonate, they live in the collective memory. Not as people, but as energy signatures. And that's who you are now. Not his girl, not his option, not his second chance. You've become a symbol. And symbols are not chased with logic. They are chased with longing. It's no longer about you, not in the literal sense. It's about the part of him that you woke up and then walked away from. The part he didn't know he could lose. The part he didn't even know was real until it was no longer reflected back to him. That's the power of feminine withdrawal. Not to manipulate, not to control, but to reveal. You revealed his limits without ever pointing them out. You revealed your worth without ever needing him to confirm it. You revealed the sacred gap between availability and presence. Because presence is not about showing up, it's about arriving whole. And now you have, not in his arms, but in your own body, your own breath, your own quiet knowing. You're no longer spinning around him. You've become the sun, and he is only just now beginning to feel the cold of the shadow he cast. This is not karma, this is not payback. This is physics of the soul, and it never fails. Because when a woman pulls her energy back, not to vanish, but to remember herself, she becomes the thing he can't name, can't find, can't replace. Her silence wasn't a punishment, it was presence reclaimed. Her absence wasn't a strategy, it was initiation. Her withdrawal wasn't closure, It was awakening. He chases not because she left, but because she finally arrived. In herself. Here's where the ache deepens. You did everything they told you would work. You loved without asking for anything. You stayed when it was hard. You listened, softened, forgave, all without being asked. And somewhere along the way, you stopped recognizing yourself. Not because you weren't loving, but because you were leaking. You thought the next explanation might be the one that made him understand. You thought if you were a little more patient, a little more forgiving, then maybe, just maybe, he'd finally meet you. But here's the hard truth. You can't reach someone who is invested in staying unreflected. He didn't run because you were too much. He ran because you were the first to mirror back what he wasn't ready to feel. That's the pitfall. Not that you were too emotional. Not that you were too available, but that you stayed too long after your energy was no longer being received. And in staying, you sent a message louder than words. You don't have to meet me. I'll shrink myself down to meet you. But there's a consequence to shrinking. You disappear, not in body, but in being. He stops hearing your voice because it's always speaking. He stops feeling your presence because it's always there. He stops valuing your yes because you never gave him a no. Over time, the most sacred parts of you became background noise. Not because they weren't valuable, but because they were never missing long enough to be missed. Carl Jung warned that what we overgive doesn't just go unnoticed, it becomes unconscious. It blends into the scenery. It loses its symbolic weight. And in relationships, what becomes unconscious is no longer felt. It becomes assumed, expected, unquestioned, and eventually, unappreciated. Let me say this with love. Over-availability is not love. It is self-erasure. Each time you explain your value instead of embodying it, a part of your soul steps into shadow. And Jung's shadow is not evil. It is unseen truth. It is the part of you that swallows your no, the part that smiles through exhaustion, the part that overfunctions in relationships to avoid the ache of abandonment. But here's what Jung taught. The shadow doesn't stay buried. It leaks. It shows up as resentment, as burnout, as emotional invisibility, as a longing so deep you forget where it even started. Because the moment you begin to manage someone else's potential more than your own presence, you are no longer in relationship. You are in performance. And no one can love the performer because she never lets herself be seen. So what do? You pause, not to punish, not to play hard to get, but to reclaim the pieces of you still waiting for someone else to name them. You stop managing the narrative. You stop filling the silence to avoid discomfort. You stop trying to be the exception in a story he's not even writing with you. Because the more you perform for love, the more you teach him to love the performance, not the person. You don't become unforgettable by staying. You become unforgettable by leaving with grace, not a loud exit, not a flurry of closure-seeking texts, not a final paragraph hoping he'll suddenly get it. You leave the way the moon leaves the sky, quiet, complete, glowing still. You retreat not out of rejection, but out of remembrance. Because when you detach, truly detach, you are no longer chasing confirmation of your worth. You are becoming it. Let this land deep. You are not here to convince a man to feel what his soul isn't ready to hold. You are here to embody your wholeness and let that presence speak louder than any words ever could. You are not difficult. You are dimensional. You are not too much. You are multifaceted. And the man who leaves because of that, he wasn't rejecting you. He was fleeing from the mirror you unknowingly became. So stop chasing clarity from someone who cannot even face himself. Stop managing closure from someone who cannot close his own loops. Let him feel your absence. Let him wrestle with the silence. Let him encounter the emptiness where your warmth used to be. Because if he ever does wake up, he will not return because of your explanations. He will return because of your essence. But by then, and here's the holy ache, you may not want him anymore. Because the woman you've become through your own return, she doesn't need a love that has to be begged for. She doesn't need a mirror to know her reflection. She doesn't need a chase to feel chosen. She is already home, and the man who cannot meet her there is not someone she is willing to lose herself for again. He doesn't miss you. He misses who he was in your presence. He misses the mirror you held up without judgment, the warmth you gave without demand, the space you created without asking to be thanked. But by the time he feels the pull, you've already returned to yourself. And from this place, this quiet, sacred center, you no longer ache to be seen. You are the seeing. You no longer chase the echo of love. You've become its source. You're not waiting to be chosen anymore. You are choosing. Choosing your peace over performance, your boundaries over approval, your energy over exhaustion. This isn't about revenge. It's about reverence. For your heart, for your life, for the woman who finally stopped disappearing just to be kept. So let me ask you something, soul to soul. What if the one thing he'll never forget is the day you stopped waiting to be remembered? Because here, at the edge of your old pattern, a new life begins. A life where you are not a mirror for someone else's awakening, but a reflection of your own. You've come home, and the ones meant to meet you here, they will. The rest will fade like noise behind a closed door. If something in this stayed with you, breathe with it. And if it spoke to your becoming, like, subscribe, share it with another woman who's ready to come home too. This space is yours, and your silence has never been so full.